Imagine expanding your team's abilities without adding headcount. At Element 451, AI assistants like admissions advisors and student success coaches work alongside your staff to deliver personalized experiences at scale, offer round-the-clock support, and uncover data-driven insights. It's not just about doing more, it's about doing it smarter. Elevate your team with an AI workforce that delivers personalized, scalable, and impactful experiences across the student lifecycle. Learn more at element451.com. Hi, I'm a higher ed CMO, and I have a confession to make. I think as marketers, sometimes we get too bogged down in bureaucracy and we forget that our jobs are supposed to be fun. And I'm thinking about how when I was at Winston-Salem State University, the Chancellor Elwood Robinson would ask me every week at least if I was still having fun. And I always had my eyebrows kind of raised because I'm like, what are you talking about? Like this is an intense job, but he's not wrong. The work that we do should be creative. It should be inspiring, and it should be fun. And I think one of the challenges that we have as leaders is to create environments where people feel really comfortable taking creative risks and doing really interesting things. That is why I'm so excited to have my friend and former colleague twice over, Robin Oliver, on the show to talk about her expertise in this space. Robin is absolutely amazing. She's the Vice President of Communications and Marketing at Ohio University, which is a former competitor of mine when I was at Miami University. And before that, she was the Chief Marketing Officer at Western Carolina University, which was also a competitor of mine when I was at Winston-Salem State. And I promise I'm not following Robin all over the country. Robin is amazing. She has some excellent advice in this episode, and I hope you enjoy. Welcome to Confessions of a Higher Ed CMO, a podcast that empowers higher ed marketers to bring innovation, creativity, and excellence to their work. I'm your host, Jaime Hunt. Join me every 2 weeks for discussions with some of the best minds in higher education marketing. Confessions of a Higher Ed CMO is part of the Enrollify Network, a robust collection of podcasts designed to help higher educational professionals like you grow. Explore our other shows at enrollify.org or check out some of my personal favorites linked in the show notes below. Enrollify is made possible by Element 451, the leading AI-powered all-in-one student engagement platform, helping institutions create meaningful, personalized, and engaging interactions with students. Learn more at element451.com. I am so delighted to have Robin Oliver on the show. Welcome to the show, Robin.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me, Jaime.
How are you today?
Doing great. There is snow on the ground here in Athens, Ohio, and we are just enjoying winter.
I'm like holed up in my office with a heated blanket because I'm so tired of the cold. And for some reason, my first floor is like 10 degrees cooler than the rest of the house. I don't want to have anything to do with that. But hopefully Virginia will warm up faster and hopefully Ohio will warm up someday. So I'm so excited about this conversation that we're going to have. And what sort of sparked it for me, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about this, but was Kay Kibbles on her Talking Tactics show talked about your Name a Squirrel giving campaign and the tremendous amount you raised, like 140% or something of your goal with this really funny, cheeky, if you make a donation, you get to name a squirrel. Can you tell me a little bit about that campaign?
Sure, absolutely. So for those of you who do not know our campus, I work at Ohio University, and it is what I call a destination campus, meaning you don't drive by it, you drive to it. So we're located in Athens, Ohio. We're a large national public, but we're situated in sort of the Appalachian region. And one of our many accolades is that we often get named one of the most beautiful campuses in America. And it is incredibly pretty here. You know, it's one of those classic, picturesque Americana campuses. And of course, covered in wildlife here in the foothills of Appalachia. And so we have lots and lots of campus squirrel. In fact, the deer are so friendly, you can walk up and feed some of them.
Wow.
and they're everywhere. So it's a whole thing. But squirrels are big in Athens. Our mascot is the bobcat. We don't pet those.
Good call.
But the campus green squirrels are, sort of a thing. We have these lovely old oak trees on our college green, and everybody just enjoys watching the squirrels do their thing. So we were looking for a way to really get first-time donors or alumni who maybe had not been engaged in the giving process, just fired up around Giving Day and excited about something. We needed something that was going to play on social media. Of course, we do all the regular Giving Day things of sending targeted emails and making targeted asks, but we wanted to get just alumni who maybe weren't annual givers to think about making a gift. And so in partnership with our annual giving team, we came up with this. We wanted to do something with the squirrel. We have a bunch of fun squirrel icons and squirrel graphics that we do stuff with. And we came up with this idea of, what if you gave a gift, you could name one of our college green squirrels. Now, obviously, we didn't actually tag the squirrels. They're not walking around with like little necklaces on that say Robin on them. And we did not limit the number of squirrels that we could possibly have on this campus. We just assumed they were indefinite.
Infinite squirrels.
So we didn't let any of those, reality checks hold us back from moving forward with this process. But so we came up with this idea to name a squirrel. And then we wanted to make it a low barrier to entry. And so we picked 1804. That's the year of our founding, one of the oldest universities in the country. Everybody knows 1804. So it's $18.04 is all you have to donate to name a squirrel. We thought that would be a fun low barrier to entry. And when we implemented this, it was like, man, if we get 100 gifts off of social media posts, we'll be excited. And then our creative team took it and just ran with it and said, okay, well, we should have squirrel certificates with their name on them. And we should have like a landing page that talks about the squirrels. And we should have all of this collateral. And, maybe if you give a certain amount, you actually get something in the mail. And so it turned into a whole bigger thing than we initially envisioned. And we ended up getting more than 1,000 gifts for people who wanted to name a squirrel. And people were giving multiple gifts because they wanted to name multiple squirrels. Like, I want one to be Joe Bob and another one to be Jimmy. So I need one for every roommate that I had during my time at Ohio University. And it took off so much that we did it again the next year. And we amped it up and said, okay, if you give $200, you're going to also have a squirrel premium package and you get the stuffed squirrel in the mail. So we just had a lot of fun with it.
One of the things that I loved, they had squirrel FAQs on their website for this. One of them is this name legally binding? And I loved while the impact of your gift is real, this naming opportunity is only symbolic. With your 1804 plus gift, we hereby vest in you the power to point at any squirrel that issues forth from any tree on College Green and call it by whatever name you choose. We will not refute your claim. Just don't attempt to hug them. Their name's not tamed. And the writing on this page is so cheeky and so fun and so creative and so clever. I just love it so much. It's amazing.
Yeah. And, you and I talked about this and I said, I can claim absolutely no credit for this, except for the fact that I hired Brooke Preston, who is our lead copywriter on my team and who did a lot of the squirrel writing. She does a lot of our work with annual giving. Brooke, my story with Brooke is that I was hiring a copywriter during COVID. And we posted the job and we got a bunch of very traditional higher ed applicants. And we actually did a little copywriting test and we got a whole bunch of people to write stuff and we interviewed folks. And I just wasn't feeling great about our candidate pool. And sometimes you're in that position where you're like, you got some candidates, but you're not really excited about one. So we failed the job search and went back to the drawing board, even though we really didn't have time for that. And one of the resumes that came in was from Brooke Preston. And it was very much, I've worked in retail resume where they're like, okay, let me just keep it to one page. I don't want to be anything more than that. And I'm going to try to make it pretty and use some color, maybe put my photo on it. It did not look like a resume that came in for a higher ed job. And she didn't have all of her years of experience on there. But there were a couple of things that were just interesting about it in her experience. And I Googled her and discovered that in her ample spare time, she's also a satire writer and has done theater and has worked on award shows and has just this really incredible history And so I pushed the search committee and said, I really would like to just give this girl a test, And her test came back phenomenal. And I was like, hired, she's the one. So I think, the lesson for me in that is just sometimes you have to take a risk on resumes that don't look like they're coming into the higher ed space where we work.
That is such good advice. I mean, truly, like some of the best people I've hired have sort of broken that mold. They haven't been what you expect. And then they turn out to be the most creative and the most innovative. And they think outside the box and they're not boxed in by that higher ed thinking that I think you and I have both worked in higher ed for a really long time. And I think both of us, because I've known Robin for a long time because we actually used to work together in the UNC system. But I think you and I probably try to break outside of that box, but it's so easy to get comfortable in that box and to just think about what are other schools doing, not what are other companies or industries and stuff like that doing.
Another great thing about Brooke is that she's an alum, and I have a ton of alums on my team. And so she knows the culture of the institution. She feels it. She lives and breathes that green and white spirit. And so that makes a big difference too. And your ability to kind of come up with things that are, in this case, it's like insider language that really plays well with the alumni audience, which I think is a huge help.
I love that. When we were talking about this, I think at AMA, one of the things we were talking about is how you've sort of built this environment where people feel comfortable coming up with these sort of kooky ideas and this creative copy. And I would love to hear about your leadership philosophy as it relates to that environment.
Yeah. When you do an interview for a new job, one of the questions, if you're a leader, one of the questions they always ask you is, tell us about your philosophy of leadership. How do you lead? How would people say you lead? And my answer, it's one of those questions that I just know the answer to every time. And my answer to that is always two things, which is respect and trust. Mm-hmm. And we talk a lot about in the creative space, a culture of trust. In higher ed, we're always trying to build a culture of trust. What does that mean? What do you do with it? And I think for me, that respect piece has to be a part of it, and in some ways comes first. And what I mean by that is that I am surrounded by people who have talent that they are not just like proud of, but that is part of who they are. Creative people, their work is more to them than work. It is this special piece of them that comes from a special place in them, and they're tied to it in this deep way. And I think that we have to respect one another and each other's gifts and the things that everybody's bringing to the table in order to then foster that sense of trust. If we're all coming to the table and they're like, Jamie's here. Let's see what she has to say today. If you're not coming up knowing that Jamie's going to bring something great to the table with that sort of confidence and respect for your gifts, then you don't hear well, and you don't listen well, and you just can't develop that trust sense without really respecting each other. And I think that's a lot of what I try to do is give everyone on the team opportunity to showcase what they're great at. Make sure that I am making the rounds, so to speak, when I'm talking about things that are happening on our team. And it's not just picking on the same people. It's like, oh, Brooke did another great, set of writing, or Aaron, our creative director, did something great, but really finding ways to dig deep into the team and to showcase what everybody's bringing to the table. Because that respect to me is where everything starts.
And I think I love the point that you're making about showcasing sort of the swath of the team and not just the same people over and over again. And I think sometimes creative people can be introverts or can be really introspective. And maybe they're not the loudest person in the room. Sometimes they're the quietest person in the room, but their depth, like the still waters run deep sort of thing. And a lot of times I have felt like those quieter people, the people who are sort of introspective, are the people that get overlooked a lot. And we don't always, it's like, well, I'm not going to bring them into this meeting because they never speak up anyway. Or you don't call out their accomplishments because they're not talking about their accomplishments. But often those people, when they come to the meeting, maybe they're not speaking up in the meeting, but they're going back thinking and that night emailing you something like, I've been thinking about this and this is what I thought and stuff like that. So I love that you talked about kind of not just the always superstars or whatever, but everybody's contribution.
Yeah. I think that makes me think of, we have a photographer here who's been at the university for some time, and he's absolutely the smartest person I know. Like he's brilliant and he's gifted and he is quiet and he goes about his work. And we had a retreat over the summer where we were just trying to kind of come together and really think about what do we want to do next as a team, because we've been through a lot of big major projects. And as part of that retreat, we did some workshops. And instead of bringing in some outsider to lead the workshop or the leadership team leading all the workshops, we actually picked people who were not necessarily on the senior leadership team to lead these workshops. And this photographer I mentioned, we asked him, we said, would you do a workshop just on like framing photography? What do people who are not photographers need to be thinking about when they're working with photographers? How do you make a photo that maybe is not exciting? Could you lead a workshop? And he took it, we did it at offsite, and he took everybody outside. We were at this little state park, took everybody outside for this workshop and just walked us around and talked about like what he's looks for in a photo, how he frames things up. And I think people on the team who had not had direct engagement with him, their attitude about working with photography, I think, changed because of that workshop. And that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, is like really asking people who are not necessarily stepping forward every time to showcase the things that they are great at, because they're on your team for a reason.
Right. I love that. You made me think about Antonio Davis at Winston-Salem State. He was our videographer, and we would do these brainstorm, like where people would bring, this is a project I'm working on and I'm a little bit stuck, or I have this idea, but I want to have kind of mini focus group, test it with the team to sort of bounce ideas, grow this idea, make it better. And so we did that every other week, and people brought their stuff to that, and it was the whole team. And I just remember almost every time he would just sit there so quietly through the whole thing, and we'd all have a conversation. And then at the end of it, he would be like, what if we, and then it was the most brilliant idea, the most amazing concept, the most creative catchphrase, the most everything amazing thing. Antonio's fabulous. He's been promoted since into different roles, but you can't leave people's voice out of the conversation, because it's like, oh, we're talking about copy. Why do we have the videographer in there? Well, why not? He's just as capable as having a creative idea about copy as a writer would be. And a writer might have an interesting idea about how to frame a video or that kind of thing. So I love that you talked about that and talked about people showcasing their unique talents and skills.
Yeah.
Other than the squirrel example, can you give an example of a project where you had, like, your team's creativity was what led to a breakthrough or a big success?
Yeah. I think the first thing that comes to mind for me with that question is the launch of our new brand platform. I say it's new. It's not new anymore, because we did that way back in 2020. We actually had been doing work to build a new brand platform prior to COVID, and then ended up rolling it out, sort of during the pandemic. So we debuted the brand platform really on our advertising platforms in fall of that year. But as our students were coming back for spring of 21, we really wanted to kind of do a bigger, broader rollout, ensure that we had built excitement around the brand. And, pre-COVID, right, you would have had some meetings on campus, you would have brought a bunch of people together and had a big brand celebration, turned it into an event. We didn't have the ability to do that at that time. And so that kind of forced us to think about how do we be creative and get people excited about this new brand platform at a time where we can't really do eventing. And so I got a team together and I said, what are your ideas? And I feel like as we were doing this process, it was the typical higher ed of like, yeah, we don't really do that. There was a lot of, well, that's outside of the norm, because we were trying to do something that had never been done before, it's by nature outside of the norm. So, we talked about we thought we need to do brand ambassador packages. Who can we build into brand ambassadors, and, who can we like put some materials in their hand and maybe get a branded t-shirt or branded sweatshirt, some note cards, whatever it is that we're going to showcase the brand on. And so our creative team came up with a really great package. And then as we were talking about, identifying some students to do this, would it be our president's leadership students, or, who would we have that would be those brand ambassadors. We're like, well, we should also send it to our foundation board and our board of trustees and, some of our key alumni, maybe our entire alumni board. And then people were like, oh yeah, we don't really do that. It's, gifting. And we're like, no, 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 that's not what this is. It's different, right? This is a brand launch, just like we were inviting them to an event and feeding them, but we're giving them materials that we want them to do something with. And so we were able to get around that. Well, one of the things that I always say will be my mark on Ohio University, we have this also part of this brand launch. So we have a graffiti wall on campus. A lot of universities do, where you encourage students, if you want to have a voice, you do it in this space. And so the graffiti wall on Ohio's campus is legendary. It's been there for decades and decades. There are alums here who have pictures of all sorts of things that were done on the graffiti wall. And one thing that had never been done was that the university itself had never done anything with a graffiti wall. It was always just a voice for students. And so because we wanted to kind of build a presence on campus, somebody said, what if we just painted it? There was some other things going on campus, and we were kind of worried about, with whatever was happening on the graffiti wall run counter to our narrative. And one of our creatives said, well, what if we just did an installation on the graffiti wall? And, of course, there were people in the room that were like, oh, yeah, we don't do that. And I was like, why not? And they're like, well, I don't know how this person would feel about it or that person would feel about it. I'm like, what if we just did it and we didn't ask permission?
I love it.
Because it's just spray paint. And if they come back and say, ooh, you shouldn't have done that, we can always just take a few cans of white and go back over it, right? And first of all, they were surprised that I was willing to do it without asking. And second of all, they were like, oh, you know what? I don't think we've ever asked. In fact, we've never really talked about it. So we did a big installation on the graffiti wall, and our sort of rally cry is Forever Ohio. And so we put a little installation up, and we invited students to come and tell us what that means to them. What does it mean to you to be Forever Ohio? And we actually, we of course, planted a few students. We had students come by all day and paint on there, their thoughts of what it means to be Forever Ohio. And we had this installation up, and of course, it drove news coverage locally. It drove a whole bunch of chatter on campus. We also had environmental that we put up and these brand ambassador packages out. We ended up doing a big T-shirt giveaway at the graffiti wall that we, advertised on social, and we had students come and pick up T-shirts, and it really just turned into a great event and, kind of perfect for that time. And since then, we have done multiple installations. Almost every semester we do something on the graffiti wall, and it's become like a way to really drive the atmosphere on this campus and to be a part of the student voice instead of separate from it.
I love that idea. And I love how you just framed that, the voice, to be a voice and not be separate. Because I think that whole barrier between the mustache twirling administration, or there's the students and then there's the faculty and the staff, and they're two separate things, but to kind of pull in that you are all part of the same community.
That's right.
I want to go back to what you were saying about taking the risk and just being like, I'm just going to do this. I'm not going to ask. I'm really curious about what advice you would give to listeners about getting sort of breaking free of the constraints of bureaucracy when trying to do something really creative.
Yeah, we have plenty of that in higher ed, right? We're full of rules. One of the most regulated industries in the world. And there are, of course, things that we do have to pay attention to. Federal law, for one. Major institutional policies. We should at least know what those are as leaders. But I think what I have found is that we also create a lot of our own barriers. And I don't know, it's true of every university. I don't know if it's cultural to the industry, if it's sort of a factor of the fact that we're just very large. And so it's really hard to even pin down whose approval do you need to move forward with something. But we tend to often be cautious as an industry and to overanalyze all of the potential outcomes of any sort of action. And, one of the things that I say to my team members when when an idea comes forward and they're like, oh, I don't know if we should do that, I say, well, let's do the exercise. What's the worst possible outcome? Like, let's say we move forward with this and bad things happen. What are they? Like, write them down. Let's make a list. If on that list, one of the bad things is someone's going to get hurt, we should probably stop. Right? Stop immediately. Go on
Right.
to another idea. But beyond that, the the worst possible outcomes you often find are not all that bad, and that's if the bad things happen that we don't even think are going to happen. And so we create these barriers for ourselves. And I think we fail to ask the question, so what if this fails? So what? And we just get paralyzed by the idea of failure and forget that failure is inherent to risk. Like, that's part of it. You are going to fail. And so you pick your failure. You say, if this is not going to hurt anybody and everybody's going to stay safe and it might actually have a positive outcome, then hey, let's just move forward with it and see what happens.
I feel like you pick your failure. It's like you could write a whole book about that. Like the whole notion of like either you're going to fail to be creative or this creative thing that you're doing might fail. Like which is worse? Because the creative thing, if it doesn't fail, is better than not having done the creative thing, right?
Yeah.
I love that. You also put me to mind of like, I remember being, and I can't remember which institution it was. And it was like, we were talking about this idea we were going to do. And somebody was like, well, who has to approve it? And I was like, I mean, I guess me, So I think sometimes like we forget that if you're like the CMO or you're the cabinet level person or you're the vice president, sometimes it is your call. You do get to make that decision and make that call. And sometimes I think it's easy to be like, oh, this is something that needs to be vetted by everybody and so, and ask forgiveness if you think it's worth it, rather than ask everybody and so. There will always be someone who will say no.
Yeah. That makes me think of something that I would want to say to other leaders like us who are in this marketing space where creativity is such a big part of what we're doing. It is a necessary part of what we're doing. Going back to your very first question, that idea of respect and trust is something that we not only have to give to our teams and foster within our teams, but it's something that we really have to have for ourselves. And all of us have been in situations, me included, where maybe you have a close colleague, someone on your team who is overly critical. And you can write down who that person is, right? You know who that is. Or you find yourself in a situation where maybe even your supervisor is constantly questioning. We work in higher ed with a bunch of people who are trained as faculty to ask all of the questions, constantly question. And that can really wear on you. And you can get to the point where you begin to stop trusting your own judgment. And that is really counter to this idea of being able to be creative and take some necessary risks because you fail to trust yourself. And I've found myself in that position a couple of times in my career, and sometimes it takes a little time to dig out of it, but it's so important to push against that and to remember that we are here for a reason. You got this job, you landed yourself here because you're good at what you do, and you have to be able to trust yourself. If there are obstacles, if someone's saying, no, the bureaucracy says that we must not do these 10 things, but 5 of those 10 are going to make a big difference in the university. It is your job to push past those obstacles, to find some way around so that you can do the thing that is going to move the institution forward.
What do students think about AI in higher ed? Hear directly from high school and college students at AI Engage Summit. Their insights will challenge your thinking and help you shape your strategy. Don't miss this free virtual event on February 25th and 26th. Register at enrollify.org/engage.
I adore that. I love what the whole philosophy behind that. And I'm really curious, as someone who's been in that position where every idea gets shot down and you start to think, well, I'm not even going to come up with ideas anymore because every idea I have is bad, apparently. How do you recommend people pushing through that? Like what tips and tricks do you have for pushing through that?
Well, as a leader, when I'm talking to my team members, one recommendation I would have for other managers is if you have somebody on your team who's really creative and they're starting to get mired in the obstacles, or maybe they're working a lot for a client who's particularly fussy and wants to micromanage, giving them the opportunity to step out of that sort of prison and step into a space where they can be really creative and do that on a fairly regular basis is so important. And then like getting behind whatever idea they have in that space, because it helps them to remember that they're really good and that the thing that they're dealing with, maybe from that fussy client or within some more constrained area of our work, does not mean that their talent is not there. And, I would come back to our friend Brooke that we talked about earlier, the talented writer that brought this conversation up in the first place. She had a moment like that where she was just kind of getting mired in the client feedback loop.
Mm-hmm.
And we were getting ready to inaugurate a new president and planning this big ceremony to welcome our new president. And I was needing her to be creative in that. And she had sent me a couple of things that were just like, not quite there. And so, I called her up and I said, hey, I'm going to take all of the work, whatever you're doing, I need a list of it. I'm giving it to somebody else this week because I want you to focus on this one thing. And I want you to forget about everything that everyone has told you that this event ought to be. And I want you to envision for yourself what you think it should be. And I want you to write me an opening script. Just make it Brooke. Make it great. Forget everything that you've heard about this event. And I freed up her time and I gave her that assignment. And she came back. I will have to send you the video that became the opening, because she came back with this incredible script that made that event, our investiture of our president, everything that it needed to be. And just, it was incredible and she just needed that invitation and that time. And I think I would say the same thing to leaders who are in our position and who are constantly like finding ourselves boxed in, is like, find a space where you can get outside of the box. There's got to be somewhere, something that you have control over and that you don't need 17 approvals for. Find that space and go be your creative self and do something amazing, and make time for that every quarter. Every quarter, find time, find some project that you can go do where you can really let your talent shine, because it's so important to just like refuel that energy.
That is such good advice. I love that you made it advice that works for the person who's managing the creative person and for the manager. Like, that is so helpful, because I think we've all been there. And sometimes it's not because people have shot down ideas. Sometimes it's because you're exhausted. You're exhausted from coming up with creative ideas, or, the parameters of the project seems too limiting to do something super creative. But like, I want this episode to really be a call to creativity, because I think higher ed needs it right now, because we're in this situation, I feel like, where it's like, in order to really differentiate ourselves, we can't talk about our excellent faculty and our dedicated staff and our beautiful campus and whatever. We have to find the other more interesting ways and creative ways to distinguish ourselves and make ourselves seem unique. And that requires a lot of us to exercise that creative muscle. And we can't just live in a space of being like the constraints are holding us back. In fact, earlier you were talking about like COVID creating this constraint for this rollout. Sometimes I think constraints force creativity, right? It's like, okay, well, if I still want this to be amazing within this box, now I have to be really creative to figure out how to do that.
Yeah. I have some good friends who have worked with me on and off over the years. I tend to be a collector of people and talent. And I think one thing that they would tell you about me is that I make the obstacles my creative work. So, yes, occasionally I do copywriting, and certainly I dive into the PR space quite a bit, and I do work product. But one of my favorite parts of my job as a leader is to play chess with whatever obstacles are put in front of us to figure out how we're going to get around them to do the thing that we want to do.
I love that.
And there's another leader on campus who I really love and respect, who's like the most optimistic person I know. And he's also taught me persistence and patience. And like when you have a great idea, don't give up on it. Maybe you walked into a wall and, you got to stop for a minute and do a circle around the parking lot a few times, walk into that wall again. Maybe that door keeps shutting. But eventually, if you just are like a dog with a bone, it's going to open. You got to figure out which door is cracked and go through that one. And it can really be a fun chess game to figure out how you are going to do the thing that is right for the institution. It's not about getting your way. It's about going the right way. It's about finding the thing that is right for the institution. And maybe there are 17 obstacles in your way, but how are you going to get past them? And that can be a fun part of the game.
Oh, absolutely. And it's kind of like, I feel like in order to be a really good CMO, you have to be a problem solver. And that's I think really what you're talking about is like, I see this problem, what pieces do I have to move to solve that problem? And I was also thinking about like sometimes I've had a creative idea that I've carried with me to multiple institutions before I found one that was like, you know what? That makes sense here. And it's like, yes, finally, this idea I've had forever can actually come to fruition. But I think that also speaks to the environment that leadership creates, where I think, honestly, in that environment, almost any crazy idea that I had brought to the table would have been embraced because it was an environment that fostered the we think outside the box. And so I love that you're creating that for your team, that there's probably people who've wanted to do things in previous jobs that they haven't been able to do, but now they can do working for you.
Yeah. And I mean, it's a great retention tool. It's a great talent acquisition tool. I have found that people, once they work for a leader who will let them, play in the sandbox and do creative things, and then they go work for someone else who doesn't, they'll come back every time. They will come back every time. I have a person on our social media team who worked for me as an intern at another university. She was a student then, and she interned for our social team there and, kind of got to know us, got to know my leadership style, then went and worked for a couple other institutions after she graduated. And then a job opened up here in another state she'd never been to. And, she's like, I want to go back and work with that team again. I want to go back and work with Robin. And so she came here, and one of the assignments that we gave her was, our TikTok was kind of sad and lonely and not getting a whole lot of attention and just not great. And it was at the time when TikTok was sort of rising to the top of the list for acquisition tools. And I said, why don't you just do something with TikTok? Get with, this young videographer we had on our video team. I said, get with Maria. You all figure some stuff out and do whatever you want, And she's like, well, what's the approval process and who do I need to? And I'm like, forget it. Just post some things and let's see how it goes, like just don't run it by anybody. Say, let the social team know, but I don't even review their stuff. Don't tell anyone. But we've kind of we let this young team just run with TikTok, and it blew up. It has been phenomenal. They have done crazy, insane things. I get people comment on our TikTok to me all the time. They're like, oh my gosh, I saw y'all's TikTok. It's so great. You're doing amazing things on TikTok. I'm like, I know. I actually don't know because I'm not on TikTok and I have no idea what they're doing, but they're doing amazing things that is really working and has really gotten us. We've actually started using it as acquisition tool and, advertising on the platform and doing sponsored content. And it's just been a huge success for us. And that kind of goes back to this, employee who knew that she could come and do fun things. And she's like, I'm never leaving. Like, because I have this job where I just get to make fun, creative content all the time.
One of the things I love about what you said was like, don't tell me. Like there were so many times where I've told my team in the past, like, I didn't hear you say that. You've never said that to me. I don't know anything about it. Wink, wink. Because just go do the creative thing. Just don't necessarily make me have to say, oh, we can't do that. If that makes sense. Like, be creative.
Yeah, I mean, my team knows that I have some things that are like important. Truth in advertising, that's a big one.
Yeah.
Not using celebrities inappropriately, folks. Like, right. I'm not up for prison. I do actually look pretty good in orange, but I'm not interested in wearing it. And, things that feature our president, I'd like to see them before you reach out to her team to see if you can schedule time to put her on video. I would want to know what that is, and those are sort of the three things that I'm particular about. And so my team knows that those are kind of the guardrails, but those are pretty loose guardrails, really loose guardrails. And so it gives them a lot of space to play. And they're not afraid to bring to me ideas either. I mean, recently, speaking of TikTok, the social team came to me and said, there's this trend on TikTok that's happening where, we got more mature people coming in and, kind of doing the Gen Z language on TikTok in a way that's satirical because they have no idea what they're saying, but they're saying it. And
Right.
they said, we have this idea. We want our president to do a tour of campus using Gen Z language. And our student employees wrote a script. So we want you to look at it and tell us if we could do it. And so I read it and I said, I have no idea what half of this says, but I'm going to trust you. And if you could talk the chief of staff into it, then move ahead. That video that we made with our president doing the Gen Z tour of campus completely blew up, not just on TikTok, but on all platforms. We ran it on LinkedIn. And our alumni were just all over. They love it. They love it, because it's just showcases the university not taking itself too seriously, having a lot of fun. I mean, we get sort of a bad rap for being this ivory tower institution that kind of looks down on the world. And that is not who Ohio University is. It's not on brand for us. We're a very accessible institution and we have a lot of fun here. I mean, we're known for having a lot of fun here in Athens. And so we embrace that and just make it part of our brand, and it really works.
I adore that. And it kind of goes back to that mustache twirling villain thing. It's hard to think of the president as a bad human when they've done something funny and clever and in sort of in alignment with what the kids are into these days. I sound so old as I'm saying that, but I mean, I still remember it was probably 2009 maybe, where McAllister University's president did a day in the life of him. And it starts with him in bed with one of those sleeping caps on, and his alarm goes off and he pulls the blankets back and he's just in a suit, as though he sleeps in his suit. And the whole thing is that he's in the shower in the suit washing his hair. The whole thing was so tongue-in-cheek and so hilarious. And I still remember what institution it was. I can still picture him. It has stood out in my mind for 16 years. And it was so funny and fresh, and it got a lot of attention. And those are the kinds of things that who could possibly be hurt, to your earlier point, by this? What's the risk? Some stuffy person might be well, that wasn't dignified. Who cares? First of all, in full disclosure, Robin has stolen several employees from me in the past. And I think I'm happy that they've gone to a great environment. But I guess one of my final questions is, what advice would you give to leaders for making sure that you're hiring people that will fit into this creative culture?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the first things that I would say to that is that the culture that you're trying to build, this culture of trust and respect and the willingness to risk and to, run around the obstacles, it's gonna take a collective of the willing. You can't be on your own with that. You need some people who trust you and who you trust to get it started, to show everyone else what is possible when you respect each other and you dive in and try new things. So you work with those people, you do some crazy things, you celebrate that really loudly with your team, and you talk about how awesome it is. And then you can begin to adopt others. If you're walking into an existing team, you can see whose eyes begin to light up and who maybe comes to the table with some new ideas. Say yes. Even if you don't really think they're the best idea in the world, give people some runway. If it's not doing any harm to the brand, then, give people some runway to try some stuff that is different. And sometimes you'll find that things that you didn't think were going to be a great idea turn out great. And then celebrate that. I have a tendency to always tell my team when I'm I did not think this was going to work. I can think of a great example of one of our TV spots, actually. So it's still running. One of our TV spots is this split screen that shows two different students having this sort of collective experience on campus, but from different perspectives. And when the idea came to me, I was like, oh, we can't do that. That's some editing technique that I don't think we can pull it off. And I told my video team at the time, I was like, this feels like a little bit of a stretch. Like, I don't know, guys. And they were like, well, what if we just shoot, 3 different scenes and just give us a chance? And I was like, okay, who can say no to that? Just go shoot 3 different scenes. Like, no problem. Comes back to me and I was like, oh, wow, like you guys really can do this. Like we do have this talent. And I mean, that just unlocked a whole bunch of doors for me. So I think when you're looking at how do you bring in people who are going to fit that mold, ask them what they know about your work. See what they highlight. Did they pick those sort of risky, fun things that you're doing? Do they even know what you're doing? That would be key. Are they excited about that TikTok video that they saw, or, that squirrel post that they saw? Or are they giving you sort of the standard higher ed speak for what should work? Maybe show them a couple of examples of the stuff that you've done and try to get them to react to some of your risky behavior, because I think that will come out in their questions and then the way that they talk in the interview process. But, it's about finding people who are comfortable with uncertainty, because that's what risk is, like not knowing the outcome fully, not being able to vet it all the way to the end, but still moving forward. One other thing that I would add about that is that there are inevitably going to be people on your team who are those people that are a little uncomfortable with uncertainty. That doesn't mean they don't have a place. Like I can think of some great people on my team who are super valuable, who do work that is much more certain and maybe much more analytical and process oriented. And you can find a place for those people for sure on your team. But just know that that's who they are. Like you're not ever going to be able to push that person to, break outside of process and expectation and uncertainty and certainty to step into like the complete unknown. It's not who they are. And so I think that has to be okay too.
We used to talk when I was at a previous institution about how we had the people who were always charging full speed ahead. And then we had some people who were like, now there's some things we need to think about. And there was a lot of tension between the two groups, right? And what we kind of came to understand was like, you needed both, right? Because the one group would just sort of sit and be in analysis paralysis and just kind of stay with what's comfortable, but they're being kind of pulled forward by this other group. But that group, if they didn't have the people kind of anchoring them, they might pull so far forward that we start to get into things that don't work and are outside the bounds of what is really, really acceptable, even at an institution. And so when you have like a good balance of that, you have the, what if we do this crazy thing? And then you have well, these are the things we need to think about before we do the crazy thing. And you end up, I think, with the finished product that's just so much stronger when you have both groups in the conversation.
Yeah. And I think sometimes you have to remind those people that are out in front that it's not creativity for the sake of creativity.
Right.
I often ask, where do we start with our marketing plan? It's the first thing we need. And people often don't have an answer to that question. The answer to that question is we need a goal. Like, what are we trying to achieve? Right. What is the goal of doing marketing at all? And so sometimes I do have to dial back the people that I've, completely taken the leash off and said, go. And then I have to come back to him and be like, now, what is our goal? Like, why are we doing this? Sometimes it's fun to do creative just for creative sake, but we should always be keeping in mind, like, what is the brand we're trying to build? What are the metrics we're trying to push? KPIs are actually important. And so that creative idea is about moving toward the goal. And so if you don't know what the goal is, or if you've lost track, which sometimes we do, it's always good to kind of cycle that back.
I love that.
There's a story that I tell to members of the team about my past that I think is relevant to this conversation. And I don't want to finish this conversation without telling it, because I think that the biggest obstacle always to innovating, to taking risk, is fear. People are scared. They're scared. And that doesn't mean necessarily that they think they're going to lose their job. It may be just being scared of failure. It may be being scared of judgment, like somebody's going to think it was wrong. Maybe being scared of rejection, like they don't want to bring something forward in a meeting because somebody else might say it's a bad idea. Maybe they're scared of getting blamed for whatever the outcome is. Fear could exist on a lot of different levels, but that's what it is. And whenever I can sense somebody is stopping themselves because they're afraid, one of the things that I say is that there's no organ in a cooler under your desk. We're like, what? And I tell this story. I worked in an agency. I had a president who was amazing and very creative. All he was creative, one big ball of creative. And I was working in PR, and he came by my desk one day, and I was like head down and like clearly upset and depressed. And he was like, what's going on? What's wrong, Robin? And I started to explain to him the big panic I was in because of the problem one of my clients was having. And he was like, yeah, I don't really care. He didn't really want to know the story. And he said, Robin, there's not an organ in a cooler under your desk. And I'm like, what are you talking about? He's like, we are 1 mile from the hospital where right now there's a helicopter landing and there's an organ in a cooler. And there's an emergency room physician who has got to pick that thing up and run it down to the 4th floor, and a surgeon who has got to get it into somebody's body, or they are not going to be alive in 30 minutes. You do marketing. Calm down. And so, that's what I tell that story to people all the time. Like and so people will say, like, they'll repeat that in my unit, like, there's no organ in a cooler under this desk, because we have to remind ourselves sometimes that the risk that we are taking most of the time is not a life or death risk. It is the possible negative outcomes will not end the world. And it's sometimes worth the possible positive outcomes to just dive in.
I absolutely love that. I love that story. This is going to be the title of the episode. Like, that's amazing. And such a good reminder, I think, for us, because, it's like, you're right. We're not saving lives. We're doing really important work, but we're not doing literal life and death work.
Yeah. I mean, there's a certain portion of what we do, right, on the communication space that is crisis comms, that is life or death. And the most important thing in those moments, that's my crisis comm training for everything. Everyone is like, what does this start with? Is safety. It's life or death. It's like, are we keeping everybody okay? But the rest of our work, all of the CMO work, all of the marketing work, all of the enrollment drivers, all of the brand campaigns, all of the work, which is 90% of my life, we can take lots of risks and we can have bad outcomes, and probably no one will know but us. So just do it.
I love it. I love it so much. Well, Robin, if somebody wants to connect with you, where can they find you?
That's a great question. I really aspire to be better on Twitter or X, whatever they're calling these days, but I'm not. So, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm just Robin Oliver. So you can find me there. And I usually respond to messages within a couple of days. I also work for a public university. So you can find my email online at Ohio University. And I'd love to hear from you. If you're really creative and you are in an environment where they're not allowing you to be anymore, drop me an email and let's talk about adding you to our team sometime soon.
I love that. So look, listen, we get a lot of people who get laid off who listen to this podcast. So I'm sure there's going to be at least one person that reaches out to you. Listeners, as always, you can find me on LinkedIn at Jaime Hunt, Jaime. I'm also on Blue Sky at Higher Ed CMO. I have officially closed my X account and my Instagram account. And so you can't find me there anymore, but you can also find me on my website at solvehighered.com. I love hearing from you, so feel free to reach out anytime. And until then, let's go bust some silos. Confessions of a Higher Ed CMO is part of the Enrollify podcast network. If you like this podcast, chances are you'll like other Enrollify shows too. Our podcast network is growing by the month, and we've got a plethora of marketing, enrollment, and higher ed technology shows that are jam-packed with stories, ideas, and frameworks, all designed to empower you to be a better higher ed professional. Our shows help higher ed marketers and admissions professionals find their next big idea and feature a selection of the industry best as your host. Learn from Mallory Wilsey, Seth Odell, Jenny Lee Fowler, Eddie Francis, and so many other of your favorite leaders in higher ed. Enrollify is made possible by Element 451, the leading AI-powered all-in-one student engagement platform, helping institutions create meaningful, personalized, and engaging interactions with students. Learn more at element451.com.